Thomas Brennan had been ranching in the New Mexico Territory for 7 hard years, carving out a modest life from unforgiving land. His days began before dawn and ended long after sunset. Tending cattle, mending fences, and fighting the constant battle against drought. He was a solitary man by circumstance rather than choice. Few women ventured this far into the frontier, and fewer still would consider marrying a rancher whose fortune consisted of little more than 100 head of cattle and a weathered cabin. One scorching August afternoon, Thomas heard gunshots echoing across the canyon. He grabbed his rifle and rode toward the sound, finding a young Apache woman pinned down behind rocks by 3 rough-looking men. Without hesitation, he fired a warning shot that sent the attackers scrambling for their horses. The woman was injured, a bullet having grazed her shoulder, and though she regarded him with suspicious dark eyes, she allowed him to help her onto his horse. Back at his cabin, Thomas tended her wound with the few medical supplies he possessed. She spoke no English, and his Apache was limited to a handful of words learned from trading posts. Through gestures, he made it clear she could stay until she healed. She gave him her name, Ayana, which he later learned meant eternal blossom. For 3 weeks, she recovered in his spare room, while he maintained a respectful distance, leaving food outside her door and going about his work. What surprised Thomas was that Ayana didn't leave once she could walk without wincing. Instead, she began helping around the ranch. She had a remarkable way with his horses, calming even the most temperamental mare with soft words and gentle hands. She gathered wild herbs that grew in places he'd never noticed, prepared meals that made his simple provisions taste like delicacies, and showed him how to read the land for water sources he'd overlooked for years. One evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Ayana's father arrived with 4 warriors. Thomas's heart hammered as he stood to face them, certain this was the end of either his hospitality or his life. But the old chief, whose weathered face held the history of countless seasons, simply studied Thomas for a long moment. Through Ayana's translation, he explained that his daughter had told him everything, how Thomas had risked himself for a stranger, how he'd shown honor and respect when he could have taken advantage of her vulnerability. The chief spoke for several minutes in Apache, while Thomas stood bewildered. Finally, Ayana turned to him, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "My father says you saved my life and protected my dignity. Among our people, such a debt can only be repaid in one way. He offers me to you as your wife, if you will have me. The choice is mine as well, and I choose to stay." Thomas stared at her, speechless, as the impossibility of the moment settled over him like desert snow. Thomas's mind reeled with the confusion and disbelief. Marriage had seemed like a distant dream, something for men with better prospects and easier lives. Yet, here stood Ayana, firelight dancing across her features, waiting for his answer while her father and his warriors watched with solemn expressions. He thought of the loneliness that had been his constant companion, the empty silence of his cabin, the years stretching ahead with nothing but work and solitude. "I would be honored," he finally managed, his voice rough with emotion, "but only if this is truly what you want, Ayana. I won't have you bound to me out of obligation." She stepped closer, and for the first time, he saw something soft in her guarded eyes. "You gave me safety when I had none. You showed respect when others would have shown violence. This is not obligation. This is my choice. She paused, then added with the hint of a smile. Besides, your ranch needs much work, and you are terrible at finding water. The following days brought a flurry of activity that transformed Thomas's understanding of community. Ayana's people arrived to prepare for the wedding, bringing gifts and celebration to his isolated ranch. Women erected a beautiful ceremonial shelter decorated with woven blankets and wildflowers. Men helped Thomas repair his corral and barn, working with an efficiency that humbled him. The chief's wife taught him Apache customs and the proper words to speak during the ceremony. The wedding itself was unlike anything Thomas had imagined. It combined Apache tradition with makeshift frontier practicality. Ayana wore a doe-skin dress adorned with intricate beadwork, while Thomas donned his cleanest shirt and the turquoise bolo tie given to him by her father. They exchanged vows in both Apache and English under the vast New Mexico sky, promising partnership and respect. The celebration lasted until stars crowded the darkness, filled with drumming, dancing, and feasting. When Ayana's people finally departed, Thomas and his new wife stood together, watching the dust settle on the horizon. The silence that followed wasn't the lonely quiet he'd known for years. It was peaceful, full of possibility. That night, they sat together, planning the future of their ranch. Ayana, sketching in the dirt where they might dig a better well, where additional shelter could be built. How to rotate grazing to prevent overuse of the sparse grassland. You know, Thomas said, watching her animated gestures. I rode out that day, just thinking I'd investigate some trouble. Never imagined I'd find a wife. Ayana looked at him with amusement. And I thought I was riding through safe territory. Instead, I found a stubborn rancher who cannot even properly track a water source. Her expression softened. But perhaps we both found something we did not know we needed. The first months of marriage brought challenges neither had fully anticipated. They communicated through an evolving mixture of broken Apache, fractured English, and elaborate gestures that sometimes resulted in spectacular misunderstandings. Once, Thomas tried to compliment her cooking and accidentally told her that her stew reminded him of his horse. Another time, Ayana attempted to explain a better method for herding cattle and somehow implied that Thomas moved like an injured buffalo. They learned to laugh at these moments, their laughter becoming its own language. But beyond the words, they developed a deeper understanding. Thomas learned to read Ayana's subtle expressions, the slight tightening around her eyes that meant she was worried about weather patterns, the way her shoulders relaxed when the evening was particularly beautiful, the focus that sharpened her features when she tracked animal signs he couldn't see. She learned his rhythms too, knowing when his silence meant contemplation versus exhaustion, when his stubbornness came from pride versus genuine conviction about the ranch's needs. Ayana transformed the ranch in ways both practical and profound. She established a garden using indigenous farming techniques that somehow coaxed vegetables from soil Thomas had deemed hopeless. She trained his cattle dogs with methods that made them twice as effective. She showed him how to preserve meat for longer periods, how to predict storms by watching bird behavior, how to navigate by stars he'd seen, but never truly observed. The ranch began to thrive as it never had under his solitary management. Word spread about Thomas and Ayana, drawing curiosity and judgment in equal measure. Some neighboring ranchers viewed their marriage with suspicion, or outright hostility, muttering about Indian trouble and crossing property lines with deliberate antagonism. But others, particularly those struggling with their own failing ranches, began to notice the Brennan spread's success. Gradually, tentatively, they came seeking Ayana's advice about water sources, animal husbandry, and land management. She helped them all without prejudice, slowly building bridges between communities that had viewed each other with fear and mistrust. One spring morning, exactly a year after their first meeting, Thomas woke to find Ayana already outside, standing in the pasture with her hand resting on her stomach. He walked out to join her, and she took his hand, placing it where hers had been. "We will need to build another room," she said quietly. "Our family grows." Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. He couldn't quite name. Joy, certainly, but also gratitude for the incredible chain of chances that had brought them together. That single decision to investigate gunshots had changed everything. He'd gained not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who saw him clearly and chose him anyway, whose strength complemented his own, whose presence had turned his house into a home. "You know," he said, pulling her close, "I used to think I was brave for facing down rustlers and surviving alone out here. But the real bravery was yours, choosing to build a life with a stranger, trusting despite having every reason not to." Ayana smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. "Perhaps we were both brave, and perhaps that is what makes us strong together." They stood watching the sunrise paint the Mossa gold, their unexpected reward proving to be not just love, but a future neither could have built alone.